Fine. So I'll just, for the purpose of recording, I will start in the beginning. So today I'll be talking about reaction-induced fingering instability in radial flow in collaboration with Dr. Vandita Sharma, Professor Manoranjan Mishra from IIT Ropar, and Professor Ching Yao Chen from NCTU Taiwan, and Professor Min Chen Kim from Jeju University in Korea. So these two movies you see in this title slides is basically representation of what I mean by reaction-induced fingering instability. So I will tell you what is how the reaction induces fingering instability, and also I will tell what is actually the fingering instability. But the one focus thing is the radial flow, which you can see that something is flowing out of center towards outward from the center radially outwards, and that's what is creating some sort of pattern, looks like the fingers in our palm. So that's why this is called fingering instability. So moving forward, so I come from IIT Gandhinagar, where I am an assistant professor in mathematics, and this is a nice campus on the bank of a river. So this is the view of our campus, and we come from the west coast in Gujarat. So this is a campus, and in our group, what we work on is basically problems on flow, transport, and reactions in porous media. And also recently, I started looking into the deformation-driven problems. But most of the things looks like very sometimes abstract, but the thing is that what we do, we take use of a lot of mathematical modeling tools, numerical techniques to solve these problems, and try to give connections to various applications, and also various kind of afterwards connections, like how these kind of techniques that we develop for solving problems is important. So moving forward, this is something which motivates the problem is of CO2 sequestration or polymer flooding that we see. So the left hand side picture you see on the screen is basically telling you how the polymer flooding or enhanced oil recovery is processed. So what is happening here? You see there is, do you see my cursor, by the way? Anyone?
Yes, we are able to see it, but very faint one.
But you see the cursor, like, because I can't see the cursor. Anyway, so on the left hand side picture, you see that from the left vertical column, we inject the CO2, and that is underneath the oil is there, which is being displaced by the CO2, and then it get extracted from the other vertical well. So this is basically the enhanced oil recovery process. And in this enhanced oil recovery process, what we observe that the CO2 displaces oil, and also the CO2 is mixed with water. So there is clearly distinct fluids, which is a multi-phase flow of oil, CO2, and the water, and they are basically hydrodynamically unstable in the form of they have different viscosity. So the different viscosity contrast drives these fluid flow into an instability pattern. Those instability patterns are being studied quite widely, and here on the right hand side figure it shows another simulation, also numerical study of such polymer flooding, where this red color represents the oil, and then the blue color represents basically the polymer which is being injected, and then how the polymer is going to displace the oil and also forms a fingering kind of pattern formations. Okay, so this is one of the motivation of studying uh, this instability mechanism that I told. Now moving forward, I want to show some more examples of all these kind of things, and actually the left hand side figure is exactly the same CO2 enhanced oil recovery I mentioned, and this picture is much clearer. Now what we see, let's first look into what is fingering instability. So if you look into this right hand side corner where the video is running, it says it shows that initially we had two fluids, red and the blue, and what is happening, there is a tiny perturbation at the interface at the very beginning, which grows into this pattern formation, looks like the fingers that the red fluid is fingering into the blue fluid. So that's basically the fingering instability happens when the viscosity of the red fluid is less than the viscosity of the blue fluids. So that is one important aspect, that the less viscous fluid should displace the more viscous fluid. that will lead to instability. And also the another important factor here is the fluid is driven by a pressure driven flow. So there is a pressure applied from left to right, which drives the fluid from left to right. Okay, so that's the fundamental fingering pattern instability occurs, and that we can easily find in this case when the water and the polymer is injected in oil. The oil viscosity being much higher than water and polymer, this polymer and water, uh, instead of displacing the complete oil bank, it also fingers into the oil bank. So that actually affects the oil recovery, and that's why these instability patterns are important to understand. Now, these are the large scale things. We talk about how the fingering instabilities are important in various industrial applications, but coming into like lab scale experimentations, it is important to understand what happens. And there are two different facets is going on here. The one thing is that you consider that once we inject CO2 by this oil, so then this oil, the CO2 gets or the polymer gets spreads radially outwards. So since it spreads radially outward, one should really consider a radial flow instead of this rectilinear flow, which is showing the movie at the top right corner. So for that purpose, what have been done? There have been several studies being conducted in laboratory experiments. For example, the bottom right corner shows this kind of exactly a radial flow fingering pattern formation in an experimental setup in which has been conducted in Tokyo with one of my collaborators, Nagatsu. Yusiro Nagatsu, they conducted these experiments. So this was a prototype where they conducted this experiment to produce the fingering instability. Now, this is fine to understand the fingering instability on rectilinear and radial setup. Now the question comes, what happens between the oil and the polymer, or oil and CO2? They actually do undergo chemical reactions. So the chemical reaction is also important aspect, and one needs to understand those the fundamentals, what is happening between when the chemical reaction undergoes, and that drives this kind of pattern formation and instability. So for that purpose, again, these other pictures shows also several experiments which conducted simple chemical reactions in laboratory. So this is an image from a laboratory experiment, a snapshot, which shows how the instability occurs with chemical reactions. Okay, so the top one shows no chemical reaction and the bottom one shows chemical reaction. You can see there is a very faded fingers observed outside this dark yellowish region, which is basically caused by the chemical reactions. So that's another setup. Now this one again a different experimental setup where chemical reaction induced fingering pattern happened. And if you really observe the differences between this bottom one with the blue and the yellow experimental snapshot and this one here with the white, uh, this picture, black and white picture, the finger patterns actually look different. In one case, the fingers goes outward from the yellow region, which is the reactant that displacing the fluid. And on the other case, the fingers are very thin black fingers are forming inside the reactants in the white region. So there are many chemical reaction processes undergoes, that is important to understand why these fingering patterns looks different in terms of qualitative as well as quantitative fashion. So to understand this thing, what have been done, some numerical studies have been conducted. The only drawback of those numerical studies were most of the numerical studies, which is one of the cases shown here, and the other case for another set of study is shown. The numerical studies are mostly conducted in rectilinear setup. Okay, now the point is the radial flow. From the fundamental of fluid dynamics, we know the radial flow behaves different compared to a radial flow, rectilinear flow. For example, for a radial source flow, if we consider, we know that the velocity decays over as the one over the distance from the source where the fluid flow is injected. Okay, whereas for the rectilinear flow, there such nothing happens, that the flow velocity does not decay. So there is a fundamental difference between the rectilinear and radial flow. And given that these two differences, comparing rectilinear's numerical modeling or the numerical simulations with experiment is a drawback, and we wanted to uh, contribute to bridge this gap between a rectilinear, between an experimental setup which is done in the radial configuration and having a rectilinear modeling or the simulation setup. For this purpose, what we do, we move forward to ask few things. So what we started with a very simple situation, and we ask, can chemical reaction control viscous fingering? This is the first question that we ask ourselves. And for that, what we consider the simplest possible reaction setup, saying A plus B goes to C. That means there are two chemical components, A and B, that reacts among themselves and forms another chemical component C with a reaction rate K. Now, on the left-hand side figures, I show the schematic of two different kind of fingering patterns that we have seen from the experimental setup, and we'll try to understand how we can model this configuration with the numerical modeling and see what are the parameter effects observed. So what we consider? We consider a square box, and then from the center of the square box, the reactant A is injected, and the square domain initially is filled with another chemical, reactant, which is B. And once they react, this forms C, which is denoted in these finger-like patterns and the pattern seen in the in between, which is schematically shown. And we have also used the Cartesian coordinate because our domain is rectangular. We write everything in the Cartesian coordinate system, though writing in the radial coordinate system would have been much better for considering the radial flow. So what can be the possible cases? There could be three possible cases. The first one says the reactants have the same viscosity as the product, and the product has a different viscosity. So the reactant A and B has the same viscosity. That means A and B, if there is no chemical reaction, they will never form any instability, because at the very beginning we said the pressure driven flow with different viscosity, namely less viscous fluid displacing more, will only form instability, and that's not possible when the reactants have the same viscosity. But we consider that the product has a different viscosity, and now product having different viscosity than the reactant can be two effects. Either the product viscosity is less than both the reactants or more, and depending on that we'll see two different scenario emerges. There could be other cases. So the second case we consider is the reactants have different viscosities and the viscosity of the product is equal to one of the reactants. Again, which one is what, that needs to be understood with more parameter study once we write down the equations and go into the non-dimensional parameters, etc. And the third case is that all three has different viscosities. Okay, we'll go through one by one. So first we consider the case, the most general setup of our domain, and then just for the visualization purpose I have shown the domain as a circular, but whether we consider circular or the square domain is not important. The important thing is that how we write down the mathematical models and the characterizations of the parameters, etc. So this is again just a representation of all the thing I told, that a reactant A is injected from the center, which displaces another reactant B and forms a product C, which is shown here in the gray region. And the dashed lines, the bold dashed line shows the interface between A and C and B and C. And the continuous dark line is showing the middle point of this product region. And the dotted circle is just a visualization of the domain where we are doing this understanding. Okay, so that's the thing. And then of course this continuous solid line, the solid circular interface we call the displacing front, where we'll see eventually the place that only one side has reactant A and the other side has reactant B. At the both the reactants A and B cannot coexist on both sides of this line. So what we are considering? We are considering flow in a porous media and the flow of an incompressible fluid. So under those hypotheses, what we need to write, the velocity is divergence V, which is the first equation. Divergence of the velocity vector is 0. And then the second equation says how the pressure drop is related to the velocity of the fluid flow. So it says that the gradient of the pressure is proportional to the velocity with a proportionality constant that depends on the viscosity mu. And of course, this viscosity depends on all the chemical components that we are talking, because we said the viscosities are going to change depending on reactants and etc. And this entire equation we write is valid in all three reactant phases and the product, all two reactant phases as well as the product phase. and capital K is the permeability of this medium, which tells that how easily the fluid can permeate through the porous media. So when we talk about porous media, we can always think of kitchen sponge or woods in which the fluid basically seeps through it. So how easily the fluids can seep through it is given by the permeability of the medium. So that's the property of the medium, and the viscosity is the property of the fluid. So both sits into this proportionality constant. And then we have three components which undergoes a transport mechanism by advection, diffusion, and reaction. So what it says, the advection, diffusion equation, reaction equation says that how this component A, B, C evolves with time and space. And so this is a nonlinear equation we can see by its own right, because it's coupled through the fluid flow velocity U, as well as the last term, which is the chemical reaction term Kr times AB, is denoting the reaction term. So telling that how the reactant, how A and B reacting and generating the product C. And as I said, the viscosity mu depends on all three components ABC. Okay. Now, what we first wanted to understand, we wanted to do non-dimensionalization of this model. So what we did, we first formulated the non-dimensionalization of this model. And before jumping into really understanding the chemical reaction, we first asked the question of something which depends on the diffusivity of a chemical species. So we first said, okay, consider that there is nothing present, no reactant, nothing, or you consider the scenario that the reactant A and the product C, they have the same viscosity, which is less than the viscosity of B. Then we denote that by some scaling argument, we can write down that the concentration of the reactant B is 0 outside, and the concentration of A plus C is 0 outside in this white region, and the other one is 1 with a scaling argument, and we eventually get a dimensionless equation that reads like the following. So we see there are two dimensionless parameter. One is Peclet number, PE, written in blue, that defines or quantifies the relative effect of advective force to the diffusive force. And there is another parameter R, which we call mobility ratio or the log mobility ratio, that tells what is the relative viscosity of the defending fluid to the displacing fluid. So since this kind of parameters, Peclet number, appears in any diffusion driven flow, advection diffusion driven flow, we first wanted to understand how that affects the general flow patterns in radial direction. So what we have done simulations, and we started with different initial configuration. That initially that the radius of the region where the concentration 1 is sitting is having different radius R0, and then we consider different scenarios to see how the instability patterns evolves. So what does the right top figure shows? The right top figure shows phase plane analysis in the mobility ratio on the y-axis and the Peclet number on the x-axis for three different initial radial position of the displacing fluid. And all the region below these curves denotes where the flow is stable, and everything above it is unstable. Okay. So yes, so that's what we do. So all the region below the lines are stable, and above it is unstable. So what it says that if we start with a smaller fluid, smaller region of this displacing fluid, R0 0.1, which is the line with the black symbols, it says the instability region is much more compared to if I start with a radial position R0 equals to 0.3. So why it is happening? Because as we told at the very beginning, the radial flow, the velocity decays with the position as 1 over r. So if I start with a very big circle that is initially started displacing the fluid, that means the advection speed at the interface is already smaller for the larger R0 compared to the smaller R0, right? So the advective force becomes weaker, and since the advective force become weaker, the instability reduces. So that's the basic understanding. What do you observe? And then what we do, we try to find a universal scaling of all the stable unstable region boundary for different R0, which is shown at the bottom figure. And it says that by simply scaling this R, this mobility ratio, which we compute the critical mobility ratio, that means the values of R lying at this interface. That's what we are plotting. If we scale that by some number alpha, which then it becomes a single universal curve, and that is proportional to the Peclet to the power minus 0.55. So that's the scaling argument we obtain. And in fact, this is nice, very good matching with some of the experimental observation where the scaling, universal scaling observed to be Peclet to the power minus 0.5. So we are pretty close to that experimental observation with our modeling. Now, with this basic understanding how Peclet number and mobility ratio affects the instability as well as the initial position of the interface, we want to move forward with the chemical reaction. So, but before doing that, what you said, this shows the summary of all these things I told, that for we have done several simulations, and the simulation shows that there is an interface which is shown by the dash dotted line here, the black dash dotted line, and the stable and unstable sort of configurations for different advection velocity, different advection speed and different viscosity contrast, namely in terms of the Peclet number and the R, looks like different pattern formation, but clearly on the top of this dash dotted line, everything is unstable, and the bottom of it, everything is stable. Then we go into the first case of answering the reactant effects. What does the reactant do? Okay, with the chemical reactions. So as I told, that the first case is that the reactants has the same viscosity and the product has different viscosity, which can lead to two different configuration. So this is the phase plane again showing two different mobility ratio defined, RB and RC, which is defined the mobility ratio of the reactant B relative to the reactant A, and RC is the mobility ratio relative of the product C relative to the reactant A. And it says this phase plane shows that there are various possible configurations of overall viscosity mu can emerge, but what we are focusing on, we are only focusing on these two cases. Okay, because reactant A and reactant B has the same viscosity, that means RB has to be 0, because as I said, RB represents the mobility of reactant B relative to reactant A. So with that, what is going to happen, we are lying on the RB equals to 0 line, that means the vertical line, and on that line we can either have a more viscous product or a less viscous product which are encircled, and they are representing the corresponding pattern formations. So how does it happen? So we go again with the non-dimensionalization of these model equations, and what we obtained this set of non-dimensional equations where we have Peclet number, we have RC, which was looking like R at the before, but just for the distinguishing feature that there are A, B, C, we write RC, and since the viscosity of A and B are the same, this is just the mobility ratio, mobility of the product C relative to either A or B, because both are the same. And there is a new parameter dA, which is the Damkohler number, characterize how the reaction rate is happening. So it's a relative time scale of reaction to diffusion. Whether there is a typo, the last equation should have a plus Damkohler AB, not minus Damkohler AB. Okay, with this, so we have three dimensionless parameter, as I said, and we have imposed these boundary conditions. So what are the boundary conditions we impose? We imposed a constant flow rate Q at the center from which the fluid is injected. So we are injecting the fluid at a constant flow rate Q. And the pressure we take, that the outer boundaries, which is plus minus L by 2 on the two horizontal directions and vertical directions, they are said to be 0. In fact, they are actually atmospheric pressure, and we know that in the fluid dynamics equation, pressure always appear as the gradient of it. So it is always unique up to a constant. So I can always add and subtract a constant to the pressure, and that's not going to affect our fluid dynamics or the fluid flow problem that we consider. Because of that, I can always make a translation to the pressure to set the pressure at the outer edges to be 0, which is actually atmospheric pressure because it is open to atmosphere. And then what we consider the conditions for the A and B and C, we consider that at the at the origin where the fluid is injected, there is only reactant A being injected, okay, and then there is no B and C sitting there. And then we consider the free flow boundary condition in all directions. That means the fluid can flow out of this domain. There is no restriction, there is no closed sides. And then we considered initial conditions. So initially we assume that the fluid velocity looks like exactly a point source velocity, which is written in terms of Cartesian coordinate as x over 2 pi into x square plus y square, and the y component or the other component is y over 2 pi x square plus y square, but actually it is 1 over r, or 2 pi 1 over 2 pi r if we write in terms of the polar coordinate system. Okay, and also initially we considered that there is a diameter d around which the product concentration, the reactant concentration A is sitting, and the reactant concentration B is exactly reciprocal to A. That means we subtract we subtract the concentration of A from 1 and we get the concentration of B in this domain. And initially there was no product present because we have not started set the reaction to start yet at the beginning. So the reaction will start as the flow evolves and etc., and we'll see how it changes. So this is the summary of some of the results. What we conducted, we solved this problem again using numerical simulation, exactly the same numerical techniques that we used for the previous case that we discussed. And then we found a few important features. So what are the important features? Let's first focus on the left-hand side figure. The left-hand side figure shows how the concentration, average concentration, this angle brackets represents the average concentration that we represents, how this average concentration depends on the radial position from the points of injection. Okay, so that's what it is showing. So the dashed dotted line is the case where RC is 0. That means the viscosity of the product is also equal to the viscosity of the reactant. And if that's the case, we'll see that this product C will undergo only advection and diffusion. No instability will form. Okay, though there is a reaction, but the reactant generates the reactant generated is having the same viscosity, so no instability will occur, and you will see the profile looks like a Gaussian, which is purely advective and diffusive nature. Then we consider two different configuration. One is the viscosity is higher of the product, and the other case the viscosity is lower for the product. And in these cases, we see two different kind of shapes of these curves. The dash dotted line, so dotted line represents the positive RC, which shows that this peak has distorted and has traveled more towards the injection direction, right? So that means the fingers are forming inward, which is the representative on the right hand side top two snapshots of the simulation, that we see that the red region, which is the product, is forming fingers inwards to the reactant, which is A. Okay, for the positive case, for the negative case, negative RC, which is the continuous line or the solid line on the left hand side, it shows that the fingers goes more towards the right, that means outward region, and this forms the finger, which is shown representative with some snapshots, is the red product region forming finger outwards, and the inner part looks like a almost circular. So the inner part does not form any instability, which is the interface between A and C, but the B and C has a finger formation. So C fingers into the region B. So that's what we calculate, and we define the finger lengths, whichever the finger going towards the flow direction, opposite to the flow direction, we call L minus, which is the finger length in one direction, the other direction we call L plus, the other finger length. And then we use this information to quantify the onset of instability. Now, what do I mean by onset of instability? The onset of instability is the following thing. What we define first of all the interface where there was no viscous fingering present. That means RC equals to 0. So in that case, the finger length will be 0, right? Because that's just a diffusive position. And then from whatever deviation happens from the diffusive position is defined as the finger lengths on the two direction. We compute this for as a function of time for different values of Damkohler number by keeping Peclet number fixed, RC and RC to be also fixed. One is positive, another is negative. And whenever this finger length deviates from the diffusive case of zero finger length, that's the time when we start seeing the instability to form, right? So that is what we have computed. And we see that with the increasing Damkohler number, the instability becomes much prominent and instability start at the earlier time. For example, Damkohler 100, we see the instability happens at a very early stage compared to Damkohler 10, which happens quite late. And again, there is little difference between the positive RC and negative RC in these two cases. And the differences between the positive RC and negative RC in terms of onset and other pattern formation decreases or reduces as the Damkohler number increases slowly. So that's the summary of it. Then what we have shown here again, the some snapshots from simulation for different RC and the Damkohler number by keeping the Peclet number fixed. So it shows an array of different snapshots. If you go horizontally in this array, it says that there is a fixed Damkohler number and we are changing different values of RC going from negative to positive. And it tells that for the negative, the fingers are always outward whenever there is a fingers, of course. And for the positive RC, the fingers are inward. And similarly, if you go now move vertically upwards along the y-axis, it says with increasing Damkohler number, the instability becomes more and more prominent and stronger. Then we ask the question that whether for all negative and all non-zero RC we have instability or not. Okay, that's the answer is no. And in fact, you can see if you look the middle column, it clearly says that there is no instability pattern formed. It's completely just a diffusive ring propagating. Depending on different reaction rate, more and more product will be generated. That's why your this color map shows more reddish towards the higher Damkohler number and more greenish, which is somewhat intermediate values, is for the lower Damkohler number. So we wanted to give a boundary between this unstable and stable zone, something similar what we did for the R and Peclet parameter space. So what we have found? We have found this boundary. Okay, so that's the boundary we have drawn between the stable and unstable zone. So everything, all the order pair RC and Damkohler sitting between these two lines is basically having stable situation, and on the either side it is unstable. One will show the outward finger, the other one will show inward fingers. So we then again to quantify it more, we define the something called interfacial length that's defined as this integral quantity. And then whenever there is a finger, the interfacial length will be deviating from a diffusive interfacial length. Otherwise, it will be diffusive interfacial length that is proportional to the square root of t. So we plotted this, calculated the onset of instability, and then these red lines I showed you, that has been given some quantification. So these are the on the right hand side figure, we have shown the symbols, these circles, which are the parameter used in the simulations and plotted. And the solid lines are our fitted model, which is some sort of exponential dependence between Damkohler number and RC. Okay, so with this we move to the next part where we consider the case 2 and case 3 together. What it says, the case 2 and case 3 says that reactants have different viscosities and the viscosity of the product can be equal to one of them or three of them are different. Okay, so we go to our model construction. These are the dimensionless equation we have seen. Everything remains the same except we have now two more dimensionless parameter, in fact three more appearing in this formulation. We already had RC, but now we have RB, we have RA. Okay, two more parameters appearing in the viscosity formula. And there is another parameter beta, which is the initial ratio or the ratio of the initial concentration between the reactants B and reactant A. This is important. Whether you are putting more reactant or less reactant at the beginning is also going to play an important role. That means which reactant has initially higher concentration is important to understand these pattern formations and instability. Okay, so we modify our boundary conditions and initial conditions suitably according to this configuration and then go into doing further study. In this case, what we did, of course, we did linear stability analysis as well as nonlinear simulations. Okay, and then what we have found doing this study, what we have found that there are a rich set of parameter space, right? We had discussed about Peclet number, we have discussed about one of the mobility ratio. Now on top of that, and then there is a Damkohler number. On top of that, we have two more mobility ratios, so three mobility ratios: Damkohler number 4, Peclet number 5, and then beta, which is 6 parameters. What we have found, instead of dealing with all 6 parameters, we can actually reduce the number of parameters by defining two important things. We define R chemical, which is a combination of RB, RC, and RA. It's a linear combinations. And similarly, we call R physics, again a linear combination of RB and RA. So why we name like this? R physics tells that the physical configurations, that means if the reactant A and B already had some viscosity difference, what kind of instability it will form in absence of any reaction, chemical reactions or product formation. Whereas R chemical says the added information coming from the chemical reactions or the product formations. Okay, so that's what we have defined, and in this figure we have shown two cases, the one particular case where the R physics, that means R physics is 0, that means RA minus beta RB is 0. Okay, so there is no difference between the reactants viscosity. That's the case, which is something similar that we did already before. So in that case, we have computed the R chemical, and then we call the critical R chemical star, which is scaled by square root of Peclet number, and n in this bottom formula is the wave number we give for the perturbation in the form of linear stability analysis, and then that has been again scaled with the square root of Peclet number to get k. So on the horizontal axis, k we see is actually the azimuthal wave number of a perturbation given to the system to study linear stability analysis, that's scaled by the square root of Peclet number. And similarly, R chemical star, which is the vertical axis, is again the R chemical times the square root of Peclet, and the modulus has been taken because R chemical can be either positive or negative. Okay, that's the source. And then we have applied a spectral methods formula as well as Sooting methods to solve linear stability analysis, and we show that the Sooting method is quite good with the spectral calculations with 7-term approximation and 9 terms approximations. So these spectral methods are actually an analytic methods, and the numerical Sooting methods are numerical methods that we have used to compute this set of parameters. And again, the region between below the curves represent the stable configurations, and the region above the curves are unstable configurations. So okay, with this, the bottommost point on this curve corresponds to the critical parameters. So what do we mean by critical parameters? We mean that we consider all set of wave number, that means all possible wave modes that can grow into instability, because an actual experimental setup or actual physical system has random noise, random perturbations. We cannot really make a control experiment to give control perturbations to a natural system. So you have to consider all possible frequencies in the system. So that's what the x-axis says, all possible wave numbers are there. And then we are looking for among all the possible wave numbers, which wave number becomes unstable, it becomes more unstable with the possible wave, other parameters, which is R chemical in this case. So that's the point which denotes the critical parameters for two different cases here. And then it shows, and these are for two different beta. The one is beta 1, the other one is beta 2, if I am not wrong. I just have to check. So these are the two cases. So one says if the initial reactant reactants have the same concentration, which is beta 1, will give different sort of parameters regime for instability and stability. Whereas if the one of the reactant is higher than the other, it will give a different configurations. Moving forward, we calculated some more quantities. What we computed critical mobility R chemical, okay, and for both positive and negative. Then we did asymptotic calculations. When the Peclet number is very large, that means Peclet number is significantly large compared to 1, what happens? And we consider Peclet number generally like arbitrary Peclet number, even smaller. For example, you can see we have gone up to even Peclet number 6 5. So what happens in this entire region, we computed these critical parameters. That means the parameter that was the bottommost point in this curve for the R chemical, that was the critical parameter. So we plotted these critical parameters as functions of Peclet numbers, and we see that it, as Peclet increases, the large Peclet limit, which are shown in the uh, bottom, these inverted triangles and the stars in these figures, are for the large Peclet number. And in this large Peclet number limit, we calculated analytically that these critical parameters should behave as Peclet to the power minus half. Okay, like inversely proportional to the square root of Peclet. So our model and our numerically obtained critical parameters from sorting method as well as our spectral method analysis is giving the right predictions that is theoretically obtained. And of course, for small Peclet number, it has to deviate because the asymptotic calculations are done for the large Peclet limit, and we do not expect it to satisfy in general for the small Peclet limit. On the right hand side, we show the corresponding critical wave numbers, which was the horizontal axis in the previous figure. N, actually it was K. We just plotted the N because the K was square root of Peclet times N. So we plotted the critical wave number. Then we went on to compute the same, do the similar calculation for the R physical and R chemical using both linear stability and nonlinear simulations. So here, let us focus a little bit more carefully on this figure. First, we start with the left-hand side. So what it says, R physics. Similarly, we define, set up this R chemical is 0, and we draw this neutral stability curve, something similar to here. But now on the y-axis, we have R physics instead of R chemistry, and R chemistry is 0. So by doing this, what we obtained, R physics critical and NC critical. Now we plotted for the linear stability analysis. Again, we did two things: large Peclet calculations, arbitrary Peclet calculations, which are shown in the inverted triangle and circles. And then we have obtained what are the trend for large Peclet limit. Okay. So we have to see that the large Peclet limit for the linear stability analysis shows it should be Peclet to the power minus 0.53. That's what our numerically computed result shows the trend, and it is closer to Peclet to the power minus 0.5. That was the analytical results. Okay. We do the same calculations like computing this critical parameter again for nonlinear simulation. That is the simulation that we have seen previously for no reaction, and also for a reactant only having the, like, also for the reaction different instability. And then what we found, the critical R physics parameter is also trending to have a behavior Peclet to the power minus 0.56. Okay, so it says that both in the linear and nonlinear regime, the critical parameters behave qualitatively in the similar fashion. It goes with the same sort of scaling, not exactly same, but almost equal scaling. Only the difference happens in the quantitative numbers, and quantitative difference is quite expected because one set of results says in the linear stability analysis that we are doing everything linearized, our perturbation equations, etc., and look for the small perturbation behavior. So whereas in the nonlinear simulations, we do not consider, neglect any nonlinearity, rather we solve the full nonlinear system, and the nonlinear system will show different critical parameter quantitatively, but qualitative trends are same. Now going into the right side figure, what we see, we now repeat this R chemical, which obviously are positive and negative two cases. We discussed the small Peclet, large Peclet, etc. And we also did nonlinear simulations, which are triangles for positive R chemical, and negative R chemical we saw with the stars. Again, we see that there is a quantitative difference, but the qualitatively they are almost same. Okay. So this is what we observe from our this more analysis in terms of the critical parameter. Now coming to finally this kind of again pictorial summary of the snapshot of our simulation. What we saw, we considered different configurations. The one set of configuration, the left hand side, the matrix shows R chemical is, and some value is this is negative, sorry, positive, and the R chemical on the right hand side matrix is negative. And then we considered these different row and column representing different parameters. So the middle row shows beta equals to 1. That means initial concentration ratio of A and B reactants are same. The top one says that it was B over A. That means A reactant was more concentrated at the initially. That's why beta is less than 1. And the bottom one shows that initially the reactant was more concentrated. That's why beta is greater than 1. And then we consider three different configuration: R physics 0, R physics negative, R physics positive, and we summarize how the pattern formation looks like in this case, in this wide spectrum of parameter space. Of course, this parameter space is not exhaustive. One can individually look for more parameter understanding, but our most important focus in this study that we published in Journal of Fluid Mechanics recently, a month ago, in focusing the critical parameters behavior, how they change with Peclet number, beta, etc. And the good thing was that we could get a universal scaling law in terms of Peclet number that we discussed just before. So yeah, now this one is the behavior, how it depends on the beta parameter, because we have seen for Peclet number how it happens. I mean, for different Damkohler number what is happens. So now we wanted to know how it beta dependence occurs. So we did for set of different beta 0.51, 1.52 for both positive and negative R chemical values. And then what we have shown, the left hand side is from the linear stability analysis, the right hand side is from nonlinear simulations. What we have seen, the inset figure shows if we scale the critical R chemical by square root of beta, they fall under a same curve, like a universal curve we find, which is again satisfies the Peclet to the power minus 0.5 in the linear stability analysis, that is consistent with our analytical results. And in the nonlinear simulation, we obtain this rescaled critical chemical R chemical, which is scaled by square root of beta, follows Peclet to the power minus 0.55 plus minus some error, which is the fitting error of least square fit. So, but these numbers are, we seen that this is universal for all beta. That means the beta dependence is resolved by just scaling with the square root of beta. Now, only one thing that is still unanswered in this understanding, and I'd be happy if anyone has any opinion on this, that why this dependence is beta square root of beta, not something else. Because he answered why it should be square root of Peclet to the power square root of inversely proportional to the square root of Peclet with asymptotic calculation of large Peclet limit, but we haven't yet managed why it should be scaled by square root of beta, not something else. So that analytical part is still missing, and we are really actively looking to understand and answer this question. So with this, I just want to wrap up. So what is the future direction that we have? The future direction is that effect of individual log viscosity parameters that we haven't done yet. As I said, we taken linear combinations of RA, RB, and RC to form chemical R chemical and R physics, but the individual the parameter study has not been done, which is much more rigorous and involved study, because it's a very rich parameter space and one has to be very careful, not only understanding this parameter, but while doing simulation, because this system leads to steep systems, radial flow, that needs a lot of very careful observations and numerical computation to understand what happens for a rich parameter space. Effect of small and moderate Damkohler number has been also neglected, because we took some large Damkohler number, which represents the infinitely fast chemical reactions. So these are one thing. Again, it leads to a steep system. One has to be careful while doing simulations. Effect of differential diffusions, because if you really look back into our model, all the equation had the same Peclet number. That means we assume the diffusivity of A, B, C are same, which is not necessary in general. In principle, different species diffuse at different rates. That means we need to consider differential diffusion, which will again give new set of parameters, and it becomes challenging, because from my experience of working with double diffusion problems, which is coming due to differential diffusions, those systems are very steep, and one needs to be very careful to carefully resolve the small scale pattern formations and the small scale uh, resolutions, stiffness, etc. And finally, we are really looking forward to have comparison with laboratory experiments, possibly exploring the effects of this Helisaw cell, which is the prototype of doing a porous media experiment. So the set of problems or the formulations we did is not exactly done experimentally, though there are some sort of experiments are done for chemical reactions, but not exactly the configuration we consider. So we are looking forward if someone comes up with some sort of chemical, some sort of laboratory experiment which can help us to understand how appropriate or good our models are, or whether we need some sort of improvement in the modeling and computations. So just a quick thing, other related problems that I'm interested in, which I'm working with my the former postdoc advisor from Oxford University, Chris McMinn, and his team, is basically again as this kind of radial instability pattern. The only difference is that now the porous medium is deformable. Okay. So we haven't talked about any deformability, but this is connected to the CO2 injections and all that. That was our primary motivation, because once you inject CO2 at a very high pressure in underground reservoirs, the reservoir rocks behaves like it's deformable. It either forms cracks or fractures or some sort of deformability, which falls in the rubrics of deformable porous medium. So there is a fluid structure interaction which is going to complicate the system, going to complicate the non-linearity, going to complicate, gives rise to a lot of rich parameter space. So these things are important. And here is just an experimental snapshot from Chris's lab, where there's a helicocell being taken, and one of the plates of the helicocell. So okay, first of all, I should say what is helicocell. So helicocell is two parallel glass plates kept with a very narrow gap, such that the gap between the plates is negligible compared to the other length scale. So it's a very small gap. So what we consider, this classically people consider two glass plates or acrylic plates. Here, one of the plate was glass, the other one was a polymer slab. So that the polymer slab being deformable, it is going to give you a deformable porous medium. And once you inject fluid into a deformable porous medium, it's going to give the fluid structure interaction, which is seen in this dark, the purple region. That's the deformation. So you see that this dark purple region forms, so which is that the deforming region, and this towards the boundary, it's less deformed. And if you look towards the end of this video once again, so when these fingers, the yellowish fluid penetrates through the edge, then suddenly all the deformation relaxes and it becomes almost uniform color. So the deformation being relaxed because the fluids now have the passage to connect it to the outside, it passes through. So while the fluid was getting displaced, it was deforming the plate, but it's get completely relaxed once again. But this is the beginning experiments. We don't have any theory yet. We are trying to understand the modeling and the theory aspects, numerical simulations, how this can be understood. Finally, if you are interested to join Applied Maths Research Group at IIT Gandhinagar, so one of the nice thing which is going on currently, we are accepting applications through early career fellowships, which is a postdoc fellowship for a year long, and it's a very handsome amount of fellowship is provided, like 90,000 plus HRA of 10,000, is quite higher than the standard postdoc fellowships in India. The deadline is approaching soon, 7th June. And if you are interested, you can just look into this website for further details and feel free to apply. With this, I would like to thank all of you for listening patiently to me, and I will be happy to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Satyajit, for such an amazing talk. So I would invite questions from the audience. So we will be putting this talk over the web also, because we have recorded it soon. So you can also direct your questions to Satyajit after you have gone through this talk again, maybe, and you can write to him. You will have his email available at the IIT Gandhinagar website. So you are also welcome to do that.
Yeah, sure. Feel free to contact me anytime through email. I'll be very happy to answer.
So if not, then we will conclude this session, and hopefully we will meet you in the next section of
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Pooja from a PhD scholar from IIT Delhi.
Mhm.
So, so overall, in short, the reason for the stabilization is basically the diffusion.
Yes.
Uh, Whether the reaction is happening or there is no reaction. The stabilizing mechanism is always due to the diffusion, right?
Invisible flow. Yes.
Okay, so all the simulations are performed for the finite Dem-Collar number. As we can see, the stable zone depends on the Dem-Collar number. It is a function of a Dem-Collar number.
Yes.
So, what can we expect for the infinite Dem-Collar number? If the reaction is very fast, so what can we expect? I mean, if there is no dependency on the Dem-Collar number, so what can we say about the stable zone sandwiches between the unstable zones?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Pooja. So actually, for there is a dependence on the Damkohler number. So think in this process. So if there is no reaction happening, then
Yeah,
of course the diffusion is stabilizing. Okay. Advection is going to unstabilize the flow because it's a flow driven instability, and diffusion is working as a stabilizing mechanism in miscible flow. There is a counterpart of its immiscible where the surface tension works as the stabilization. On top of that, the reaction is going to do some additional effects. So what is the additional effect? If the product generated, let's say we consider the configuration that the product generated is high viscous compared to the displacing fluid, then of
yeah,
course the chemical reaction will induce some instability, right?
yeah,
Now, if your Damkohler number is very small, that means you are generating the product at a very slow rate.
yeah,
So once you generate the product at a very slow rate, actually you need to satisfy a critical log mobility ratio for having instability that we understood when no chemical reaction was considered, only Peclet number and R, right? Now, if your chemical reaction is very slow, such that you never reach to the critical parameter, critical mobility ratio, you will never see the instability, even if it is a high viscous product is generated. Now, with increasing Damkohler number, you will see that the instability will occur slowly at a time which was not observed for a small Damkohler number. And for the infinitely fast Damkohler number or infinitely large Damkohler number, the instability will be instantaneous because immediately the product will form, which will reach the critical parameters of the critical mobility ratio, and the instability will be observed. So does that answer your question, Pooja?
yeah. It means that the stable zone will disappear at infinite Damkohler number.
uh, it does not disappear exactly. It depends also on what is your Peclet number is, right?
Okay.
Because when there was no reaction, that means there is always some sort of mobility ratio present.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So it's not going to disappear, it's going to shrink with increasing Damkohler number. And that's what was seen in one of the one of the summary result we have seen. With increasing Damkohler number, the region was shrinking, right? It's
Yeah.
not going to disappear because you will see there will be little place where critical parameter will be always sitting into place.
Yeah. One another question. Uh, the same can be happen in the rectilinear flow, right?
Yes.
Because there is also a critical Paglet number and the log mobility ratio between below this, the flow will be always stable. So the same can be happen in linear displacement, right?
Yes.
So I mean, what is the basic difference between these two? I mean, geometries. We can say two different displacements.
Yeah. So
Maybe, yeah.
yeah, so that's another good question. As I stated at the beginning, that rectilinear flow, you consider a rectilinear flow in a porous medium, and as we wrote, the equation is the velocity is proportional to the pressure gradient, right? Now, if I start an interface, let's say at the position x equals to L or x equals to 2L, the interface advection is always the same irrespective of its position, right? The interface between the stable and unstable fluids, or the displacing and the defending fluid. But for the radial flow, what happens? That's what we discussed about for different initial radius. So if my reaction rate is very slow, then to reach, that means the Damkohler number is small, to reach a critical mobility ratio, we need some time. And by that time, the product will be also getting displaced because of advection in radial flow. So it may happen that it reaches certain position where it has obtained a particular value of mobility ratio, but that's not critical mobility ratio at that location. It was critical for a closer location toward from the injection port, but it is not critical for a far field, because with the effect of the interface position, we have seen how the stable and unstable zone changes. But in the rectilinear displacement, I started the interface here, A and B, and it started getting displaced and product forms. After some time, I obtained a critical mobility ratio that is position independent. So it will start giving instability, but the same may not be observed in the radial flow. So these are the fundamental difference of a rectilinear and radial flows.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for answering my questions.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. Yeah.
Any other questions? So if not, then we will conclude the session, Satyajit.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Satyajit, for this talk.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Jyoti.